All right, time for another Patreon episode. This one is on the very much forgotten adaptation of Steel, the DC Comics character from the 1990s. This also has the biggest guest we ever had for Film Rescue, which was Jon Bogdanove. He was the co-creator of the character of Steel for DC Comics back in the 1990s in the Death of Superman storyline. God, this movie is... I don't know what the thought process was behind this movie. I mean, I get you want to make an adaptation of this character, but they changed so much, and it's not really in the DC universe. It's kind of in our universe, but they use the character. They make references to Batman and Superman, but it's not. There's no other characters from that universe. It doesn't make any sense. It's very odd, and Shaquille O'Neal is not an actor. I don't know why he was cast for this. I don't know why they put him in this. This feels like an enormous misfire. Yeah, it's very cheap looking. It's very ugly. It's not like a painful movie to sit through. It's just very, very boring. But we had a lot of fun on this episode. Russ Burlingame, this is one of his early episodes with us. He comes in and reworks the movie to basically fit it into the timeline of Batman v Superman, which was overall interesting. I mean, I don't like that movie at all, but it's nice that he kind of ties this story in with that. It's like, okay, we'll let that go. But yeah, like DC back in the 90s, they were really struggling to figure out what the hell they were going to do. There was a Batman vs. Superman crossover in the 90s that never got off the ground. They were trying to do a Justice League movie with George Miller. That never went anywhere. It was a tumultuous time in the 90s. And of course, Batman and Robin, we all know the story there. But Steel is just kind of a movie that sort of came, it went. Nobody thinks about it. Nobody talks about it. But we did for this episode. So here's our extended Patreon edit of the Film Rescue for the film Steel. Enjoy.
Hello, everybody. This is Jesse of Film Rescue, Palette Cleanser, Split the Difference, etc., etc. Just wanted to put a little preface before we start this episode. When we recorded this episode, we had both Russ and Jon basically recording through their phones, so it wasn't like, they weren't using microphones or anything like that. So we recorded it using CraigBot, which is a recording software that's directly through Discord, which basically captures your audio track. Typically, we record using Audacity or Audition, and then we just sync the files up together, but they had a long conversation where they were just talking about comics because Russ and Jon know each other pretty well. They were just talking about comics for a while, and we wanted to start the episode, but we thought, you know what? This is really good content, and this is a very good conversation. Let's just let them keep going. So there's a good 20 minutes that's on the Patreon episode at the back end of the episode where it's just them talking about Jon's time in the industry and how the industry is changing, things that happened at DC, and things like that. So the audio quality isn't quite as good because we only use the Discord audio file. I didn't use the Audition file because trying to sync them up, I had started my Audition recording until like 20 minutes in, so my voice wouldn't have been on their recording if I just use my Audition track and their Discord track. So we ended up using all the Discord audio. It's a little funky. It's a little messy here and there. But overall, it's not too bad, and overall, the conversation was so good, and the quality of the conversation was so interesting that we said, you know what, let's just keep the whole thing, and let's just have that at the back end of the episode for a Patreon episode. So if you go to the Patreon and subscribe for $1, you can hear Jon and Russ just talking about comics. It's really good content, a lot of good information, it's a lot of fun, and just hearing an actual professional talk about this film to such a degree, their own creation having been turned into this film, is a lot of fun just to chat about. This is probably one of the best episodes we've done this year, and I think Jon is probably the biggest guest we've had so far this year. It's definitely one of my favorites, and it's probably Seth's and Aaron's favorite as well. So sit back and hear our discussion about the film Steel.
Welcome to the Film Rescue Show. We're lending a helping hand to Hollywood in fixing their feature films and flops And boy, do we have a flop today, and boy, do we have some guests to talk about it. I'm joined by our usual hosts, Jesse and Aaron.
Hello.
Hello.
And we have two extra special guests. I don't even know how this happened. This just kind of fell into our lap. All I can say is thank you to Russ. You are a journalist, writer, many accolades to your name. Thank you so much for emailing into the show.
Absolutely. I've enjoyed the heck out of this show since somebody put me onto it recently.
If you can ever remember who they are, thank them for me, because
Yeah, absolutely.
this is lovely. And we're also joined by comic book writer and artist Jon Bogdanove. Did I pronounce that correctly?
The accent's on the A, so it's Bogdanove.
Bogdanove. There we go.
It's very much like for film fans, it's like Peter Bogdanovich, the director, but you scratch the itch.
Gotcha.
I love that.
And we are here to discuss the film Steel, directed by Kenneth Johnson from 1997. This is very interesting because, Jon, you have a unique insight on this character, don't you?
You could say that. Steel was created by Louise Simonson and myself during our run on the Superman books in the early 90s.
I don't know how this happened. I'm literally aghast that you're here to discuss this movie with us. Very exciting stuff. I like to start the show off with positives. And let me spin the wheel here. Russ, let's start with you. What is a positive takeaway you had from the film Steel?
Well, one positive I will say is it's not nearly as bad as I remembered. I saw this movie in theaters, and I remember that because I went with a buddy of mine who worked for the company that cleaned the carpets at the theater, and so we got in for free. And then we got there, and we were the only two people in the place.
Oh, wow.
And so they screened this for us and lost money doing it.
Oh.
But so I remembered it as being a pretty dour thing, and ultimately I think it's incredibly forgettable, but it's not personally offensive. So there's that. On a more straightforward way, I've always hated the costume, but I look at it now through the lens of 10 years of the Arrowverse. And I actually kind of think that the mask is terrible, but the costume itself is pretty salvageable. It's really just a question of that mask being so bad.
This is totally Arrowverse material.
Which again fits the movie, because I think that one of my biggest takeaways rewatching this movie was like, holy cow, every single piece of this looks like it should have been in sci-fi.
Yeah.
Why didn't they include this in their crossover of Crisis on Infinite Earths?
You know, they should have.
It would not surprise me if Mark had reached out to Shaq, because I know that he reached out to Nick Cage just to be like, hey, you want to be Superman for 2 seconds? Needless to say, that did not happen. Cage was shooting a movie.
Oh,
damn!
Sad.
But you know, had Nicolas Cage shown up for 2 seconds in that craptastic Superman costume from Tim Burton, that he would have given it his all.
100%.
It would have been short.
Hey, I still want that movie. I don't care what anybody says. I don't think it would have been good, but it would have been interesting. More interesting than the current Superman stuff that we're getting in theaters.
Ooh.
Yes.
Yeah.
And well, that's another story. If we're going to invite me back to talk about the current Superman movies.
We've done. I've already fixed Man of Steel and BVS. We don't need to do it again.
Jon, how about you? I'm curious. Were you involved in any way, shape, or form with the film before I ask any other questions?
Well, one of my suggestions for how to rescue this film would have been to involve in any way the two creators who invented the character.
Oh, jeez!
Wow!
Yikes! That bad, eh?
Oh, like.
I mean, the most ironic moment of my career was drawing the comic book adaptation of the film adaptation of the character I co-created, after having had no input into the film at all.
Wow!
Did that hurt? Like, that's a kind of a dick move on their part. I'm not gonna lie.
Well, I mean, of course it hurt. I think Wheezy and I would have loved to at least been consulted, and then even if they went and did the same crap, or at least we'd have been consulted. On the other hand, that's sort of the nature of the business, certainly in those days, to just ignore the contribution of the creators. And by not having had anything to do with the movie, I can come on the show and speak critically about it.
Now, John, one thing that I did want to kind of point out is it's incredibly rare for comic book creators to get the opening credits title card that you and Wheezy got.
Yeah.
Like that's like Jerry Siegel and Bob Kane territory.
Right. Well, I mean, again, we had nothing to do with that. That was probably the influence of Jeanette Kahn, because Jeanette was actually a kind of a good egg, you know, and she rightly realized that it didn't hurt anybody to give creators credit.
It was a very novel thing back then.
It was a novel thing back then. And so I think she had a hand in that. So that's one of the nice things about the movie. There are other couple of good things about the movie.
Go for it. Yeah.
One is we get a check for 40 cents every few years.
You should really frame one of those and just make it a collector's item.
Another thing is, I don't know how many superhero movies starring a black hero there had been.
True.
Yeah.
I don't think any at that point.
Right.
Because 1 year later we would get Blade. This was kind of the tail end of the awkward years of comic book movies. 1 year later we got Blade.
Yes.
You did have things like Meteor Man, but I think Meteor Man had already come out by then. But that's obviously not a true adaptation. It's just a superhero story.
It's a superhero story.
Yeah.
I don't know Meteor Man at all. So
it's a Eddie Murphy bomb, I think.
No, it's not Eddie Murphy, but the guy looks a lot like him. I know who you're talking about. It's not Eddie Murphy though.
I know it only by name, so I'm probably confusing it with Pluto Nash.
You're thinking of Pluto Nash, and no. For anybody wondering if we're gonna touch Pluto Nash, no. There's a certain subsect of film that's so bad we'll never touch it. So
yeah, you want films you can actually rescue.
Yes.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, so you know, I mean, it was nice. It was nice to have something to do with increasing diversity. It would have been nice if either Louise or I actually were black, but I don't think, we didn't think much about the politics of Steel when we were creating him. We were really thinking about the character.
Yeah.
And so we never set out to like create a black superhero. We created a character who would work best if he happened to be black.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. I actually picked up the Reign of Superman trade on Wednesday when I went to get my poll box, and I went through it and I basically said, oh, it's Luke Cage meets Iron Man.
Well, yes. Now that sort of touches on the creation of the character. Wheezy and I were thinking about, what does DC need? What is the pantheon of DC missing? And they really, at least from our perspective, didn't have an Iron Man type character.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why he's an armored guy.
Right.
But the mythological allusions with the historical John Henry, who it turns out was an actual person.
Yeah.
Gave the thing verisimilitude, so he had to be black. The legend of John Henry is one of my favorite stories from childhood. Yeah, I actually somewhere have drawings of the story, not Steel, but the original John Henry.
Oh wow.
That I drew when I was a teenager. just because I love it. There's you know, the sacrifice of the big man for the dignity of humanity. It's a thing that resonates with me.
Yeah.
Um, so, but in the physical design of the character and the way he's actually drawn, I was really trying to give DC a viable Iron Man character, um, and I gave him sort of a marvelized version of a Superman cape, um, and so yeah, he was black, but it wasn't like, oh gosh, we're white people and we're going to create a cool black character. He had to be black because the original John Henry was black.
Yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't like forcing diversity. It was like, well, it's just he's just a black guy. That's just
And
how
of course, us blithely in our white privilege, never even thought of the implications, of
Sure.
what it means to write a black character, and do we have a right to write a black character? I mean, I think we do, just as the way that black people have a right to write about white people.
Sure.
But we didn't do it perhaps with the wokeness that either of us has now. I don't know. I can't speak for Wheezy. She was probably more woke than I was. I was just trying to make a deadline.
Right.
I mean, I feel like that story about Franklin Stern and the KKK is pretty. For the time when it was published, that was really, really smart stuff.
Well,
Yeah.
thank you. And I think the salient phrase there, for the time it was published. I'd like to think that a lot of us in comics, I mean, even starting with Jack when he invented Black Panther, have tried to be, in our comfortable overweight white guy way, agents for change and agents for diversity.
Sure.
Over the years, by and large, and we've made some missteps along the way, but we're now heading into a much more diverse generation of creators, and I'd like to think that we had something to do with making that possible. Making that paving the way a little bit.
Sure.
Yeah.
I love that.
Anyway, the good stuff about the movie is, one of the first black superheroes adapted to film. Pays me 40 cents every now and then. Happened because Shaq loved the character.
Interesting.
So that's sort of I mean, he was sort of the driving force behind that. The way, what I heard, and this may be wrong, is that after Kazam or whatever the genie movie he did was.
Oh God. Oh, that thing.
You mean the one that Sinbad did, right?
yeah. Where somebody looked around and said, "Holy crap, this made money." And so he said, "Shaq, what else do you want to do?" And Shaq pulled out our comic book. So I'd like to do this. And I don't think anybody else connected with the movie had any conception about Steel or Superman or anything else like that. I mean, I think that they dug up Kenneth Johnson, who, Kenneth Johnson is sort of, I mean, I loved the old Hulk show, right?
Yeah.
I did. But I listened to interviews with this guy, and here he is. He's one of these guys of a generation of filmmakers that actually David Goyer is sort of one of. Where
that's this is bad territory.
I know, and I'm out on a limb, but he makes his living standing on the shoulders of guys like Jack Kirby. He makes a living standing on the shoulders of genuine geniuses, and derides them every step of the way.
Ooh.
And the geek shame that guys like Kenneth Johnson and David Goyer exhibit has sort of marred the early years of superhero adaptation. A lot of the reason that this cultural mythology, which is genuine, 20th century American mythology.
Yeah.
The reason it took so long to get a credible version of any of it on the screen was because the first two generations of filmmakers were embarrassed to take it seriously. They were embarrassed to look at it as mythology. They were embarrassed to take it on its own terms. They felt obliged to make it camp, or they felt obliged to somehow elevate it. You know, you listen to there's this interview with contemporary interview with Kenneth Johnson, and he's talking about you know, how he tried to make this silly, ridiculous character into something, so that, you know, he would treat David Banner, because he hated the alliteration of Bruce Banner. He would try to make David Banner like Jean Valjean, you know, and he needed an Inspector Javert, and so he created the reporter guy. And I'm thinking, like, dude, fucking read the comic book, you know, Thunderbolt Ross.
Right.
You know, it's you're not inventing this. There's a mythology there with deep cultural roots, and it all works.
Yeah.
Read the damn comic book.
Yeah, earlier today we talked about Fantastic Four, the 1994 version versus the 2015 Fan Four Stick. We compared and contrasted those, and we had Jack Packard on here as a guest. And every single time we were talking about Fan Four Stick, he was like, all the mythology was already there, guys. Why did you go so far away from it? It's already there, laid out for you. Just use that.
Right.
It's like my fix for, you know, Three Musketeers was to just, you know, actually follow the good plot that was in the good book that was written with the same title.
Yeah,
Right.
there's a reason it's a classic. There's
Right.
a reason it's a literary classic.
Which, without spoiling too much, is very close to what I would suggest to do when we get to the fixing part.
Absolutely.
Nice.
Well, yes, of course. I mean, when adapting anything, and it doesn't have to be comics, of course, superheroes suffered from a stigma from the moment they were created.
Mm.
You know, comics were tantamount, they were maybe half a notch above pornography in terms of cultural legitimacy.
Sure.
But that doesn't matter. If you're going to make a big budget picture about smut, get inside the smut and find out what makes it work. What is the intrinsic charm of the thing? What makes it work?
Yeah.
Don't reinvent the wheel in blithe ivory tower ignorance of what you're doing, and then deride it the whole time, so that, you know, you don't get typecast, God forbid. Take it legitimately. Look at the source material and have the sense and the humility to figure out why it works. You know, anyone can come up with ways to deride anything.
Yeah.
Really, you know. But if you're concerned about that, if you're concerned about doing a film project, putting you in some sort of comic book ghetto and not being able to do serious film thereafter, then don't take the superhero assignment.
Yeah.
You're going to take the superhero assignment. Pay attention.
Yeah, one of the an episode we did at the beginning of our season was on Star Trek Nemesis. And the director was Stuart Baird, who had an open contempt for Star Trek in general. And so we kept asking in the episode, it was like, if he hates this material, why is he doing it?
Right.
That's my David Goyer complaint right there.
Right.
Yeah, if you hate this stuff, why are you doing it? Oh, money? Oh, okay.
I do think that Patrick Stewart has single-handedly done more to help sci-fi and superhero films as actual serious acting vessels than any other actor that I can really think of.
Well,
Probably
I think
true.
so. And I mean, one of the things that marks Patrick Stewart's work, all of his work really, is that he doesn't care if it's Shakespeare or comics, or I saw him in some kind of, oh God, late 80s horror movie with lady space vampires or some
Life
such.
Force.
Life Force.
That's
I
the
love
one.
that movie.
Yeah.
That's the
God.
one. And I'm watching that. I'm not even expecting he's in there. And I'm like, holy crap, that's Captain Picard. the thing is, he's not just committed, because like Nicolas Cage is committed, but and I love Nicolas Cage.
Me too.
I'm not slagging him at all.
No.
But Patrick Stewart works to find whatever is real, whatever is the intrinsic charm, whatever is the intrinsic appeal of whatever he's working on, and then does everything he can to translate that through his performance.
Even in the Emoji Movie, which was terrible, where he played
yes,
cartoon
even
poop.
as the turd emoji.
He went in with like 150% gravitas. I'm like, you know what? I gotta hand it to the man. At least he didn't just come in, jack off, and collect his paycheck, because a lot of
Right.
actors would in his position. He gave it his best. He had a character in Oblivion, the video game, that died within, like, I don't know, the tutorial, and he
Yeah.
was given 93 pages of preparatory work for that character, and they were afraid that this backstory was going to scare him off, and he was overjoyed that they had given him so much material and wished more people were that prepared.
Wow.
Yeah.
Aaron, how about you? Positives on the film. I want to touch on everyone before we can tear into it a little bit more.
So I watched 15 minutes of the film and then realized that I wasn't high enough to watch this film, so I got really high and I started watching it again. And I must say, if you're high as shit, it's actually pretty passable, especially because I was born in 1983. So like it just feels like my childhood, like the music, the fashion, all that stuff is very reminiscent of my childhood. So I've got that nostalgia vibe. But there actually is a decent representation of a disabled character in this film.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
every time I thought, because I'm an ambulatory wheelchair user, and one of the things that I hate about disabled characters in movies is that if they're paralyzed, some hinge in the plot tends to be, oh, they need to walk again, or they need to be given some superpower or some like suit that allows them to walk, something that overcomes this. Whereas a person with a real disability is more likely to do what she did in this situation, which is pimp the fuck out of your wheelchair in every way possible. Because, like, if you use a wheelchair, it's not something that holds you back or limits you. It's something that allows you to do things that you couldn't ordinarily do. So it's like it's an extension of you. You want it to function the best that you can. And I was shocked that they even had like positions to put her in a situation where she's going to hold everybody back, and she never held any of the characters back. She held her own even when escaping, when in combat, like
Yeah.
every situation she was immensely capable in. And I love it when you can show a disabled character that has utility and not like, oh, the autistic guy is also smart. Like it was actual decent disability representation. I was flummoxed, I'm not gonna lie.
Well, what's going to be more useful in a chase scene, really? High heels or a wheelchair?
Exactly.
Yeah.
She
I actually
also
noted in our when we were doing the watch of this, I said, "Oh, it's just Oracle."
Yeah.
It's from Batman. It's just Oracle. It's just Barbara
Yeah.
Gordon. That's all it is.
Oh, I love her.
She was also probably genuinely one of the best actors in the movie as
Yes.
well.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah.
Really charming, and she was adorable.
And as somebody who was a teenage boy at that time, she was just gorgeous.
Oh yeah. I
Oh
bet.
yeah. Oh,
Yep.
just
Yeah.
total heartthrob. Jesse, how about you? Positive takeaways?
Richard Roundtree is in this movie. Good old Shaft. That's great.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, he is.
With the Shaft joke.
With the Shaft reference, yep.
Yeah, I get it.
And
I get it.
also fellow Mainer Judd Nelson.
Yep.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And he is, let me tell you, 130% Nelson in this movie.
It's
Oh,
so
God,
weird
yeah.
that he's like low rent Bruce Willis in this movie.
Yeah.
Kinda.
Yeah.
I could see that. I
I see
could.
that.
Yeah.
He came a long way from the Breakfast Club.
Yeah, for real.
Very
Yeah.
true.
Although I have to say, there's a scene shot in Echo Park where John Henry is meeting Judd's character, and the minute I saw that, I thought, honest to God, I really think that any movie where it's Shaquille O'Neal versus Judd Nelson is going to be a pretty short movie.
Yeah. Yeah.
Truth.
Yeah. The other positive, the general plot of him being a weapons designer and his weapons get on the street and he's trying to stop them. That's generally the plot of the first 3 issues of Steel.
Well, it's
They-
generally the plot of the comic book.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's generally the plot of the comic. Although the only thing that's different is that they just removed all the other DC content. There's no Superman. There's no Eradicator. No Superboy. There's no references at all to it being in Metropolis. There is no Metropolis. Basically, they took the character and put him into the real world, literally into the real world.
Yeah.
It's kind of like what they did with Batman with Chris Nolan's movie. It's like, oh, he's just in the real world. There is no Superman. It's like, but we'll get into the negatives when we get to it. But yeah, it's generally the plot of the original comic, but it really does feel a little bit lacking in that you don't have Superman there, the conflict of him being inspired to be Superman. So.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, you could have covered even if Superman didn't exist in the Steel movie universe.
Just say he's dead.
No, he doesn't even have to be dead. He could be a fictional character.
Yeah.
Like an Iron Giant.
He does have the tattoo.
Iron Giant is as inspired by Superman as John Henry is.
Yeah.
But just make him a comic book character.
Yeah, well,
Which I will say,
they do make references to Batman and Superman, and he does have the tattoo of the Superman logo on his arm.
Yes, well, Shaq actually had that. That was actually a real tattoo.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I was actually going to say that's what I was butting in to say is I had to search it to make sure. I knew he had a Superman tattoo, but it really does say the Man of Steel on his tattoo.
Yeah.
Nothing about that was added.
Wow.
Oh.
That's cool.
Okay.
I would have expected him to have a more higher budget looking tattoo, but I guess this was the mid-90s.
I also think, honestly, that he got it when he was like a teenager. He probably didn't get millionaire tattoo.
Yeah.
I love how big of a nerd he was.
Shaq legit was a fan of the books, and like I say, I know he's not the world's best actor, but he his heart was in it.
Yeah.
His heart was genuinely in it, and by me that sort of overcomes some of the lack of directorial effort to help him act.
Yeah.
He does come off as very sweet and very polite. Like those aspects of the characterization come off very genuine.
Oh yeah.
They kind of incorporate him into the character where he's like, I could never make the free throws. I'm like, I get it.
Yep.
Yeah.
I think for me, this is one of those infamous quote unquote bad movies that I had never had the chance or will to watch. And I think I was expecting it to be so much worse the way that it's been played up on the internet that I very passable. I didn't have a terrible time. I love the comic book character. It's my younger brother's favorite character of all time. Actually inspired him to get into drawing and art, and those aspects I think is what were my biggest letdowns. Where like functionally, if you take the Steel name away and you just make it a movie with any other name, I wouldn't even have any major issues with it. It's very competently put together, no out of focus shots or bad lighting or anything like that. I'm curious why it has the infamy that it does when there are much worse superhero films, especially from the 90s. Like, I don't know. That was my big takeaway.
Well, I would say a big problem is that the amount of waste in the movie, because I was just checking the budget on this. The budget on this film was $16 million.
What?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. $16 million. Guess what the budget of one of my favorite movies of all time, RoboCop, was? $13 million.
Oh.
How the hell do you spend less and it looks better?
How the hell can you not afford a plane ticket to fly two freelancers out to California for 15-minute conversation?
I mean, they flew you out for the Lois and Clark pilot.
Oh man.
There are definitely some scenes where Shaq is running and he looks downright unathletic. And I've watched him run a lot. Like he is a large man, so there is a bit of, he's not like a sprinter, but he just looks so lumbering and clumsy in this film.
Are you talking about when he's wearing the suit?
No, before at the very beginning where he's like running after the bad guys initially before he makes the suit.
when he's in the purple polo.
Yeah. the
Yeah.
dark
Oh
polo.
yeah. You're right. Yeah, it is. That is odd.
It-
Hmm.
Maybe on purpose. I don't know.
But he was in the military, so you'd figure he'd be athletic at any rate.
Maybe what it was that his gait is so long and he runs so quickly that the other guys just couldn't outrun him regardless. So he had to intentionally run slowly.
That's a good point. He was way taller than those people. He had them
he's way
right.
taller, which means he moves quicker.
Also, I imagine being a steady cam shot trying to keep up with people on a foot race might be difficult.
Yeah. That's why you attach it to an ATV.
There you go. All right, let's transition into our downsides to the film, things that we did not like. John, let's start with you. I'm sure everyone's very curious what your letdowns were for this film, beyond the fact that you were not consulted, which is hindsight being 2020.
Yeah. No, I've
very
I've
bad.
made enough of a meal of that. The movie suffered from a lack of concept design. A lot of people talk about it looking, like a late 70s television production.
Yeah.
Right? Not even Arrowverse yet, but more like Bill Bixby and Lou Ferrigno.
Right.
I mean,
I
Arrowverse
think-
looks better than this.
Yeah, I think most of the Arrowverse does
Yeah.
look better than the movie. One of the things about the Arrowverse is, by and large, they're using the distinctive likenesses of the characters. They're designing costumes that look like the comic book character.
Yeah.
And that completely lacked here. And I understand the practical difficulties with a 1970s technology of designing believable action armor, right?
Sure.
But they're spending $60 million on this, and they're still using, injected foam, metal painted injected foam for armor. It just seemed, even for the 90s, it seemed like either poor conceptual design or unsophisticated technique to create the
Yeah.
armor. I mean, Shaq is a big man, right?
Yeah.
To move over 300 pounds and 7 feet of muscle, he's got large gluteus maximus muscles. Right? If you add another 3 inches of foam around that ass,
Yes.
Badonk-a-donk.
no wonder.
He was
No
pretty
wonder.
caked up. He was pretty caked up for sure.
And that's why you should have had a cape on this guy. It would cover
Yes.
Oh,
There should have been a cape over that ass.
that.
Can I pick
man.
up? There's one thing I forgot to say in the good that ties into the cheap costume,
Yeah,
which
go
is
ahead.
the sequence where clearly it was originally scripted for him to fly, but they didn't have the money, and so instead he goes up the escalator, waving goodbye to
yeah.
those people, was just unintentionally one of the funniest things I've ever seen in a superhero movie.
Yes.
Yeah, he flies in the comics. He does not fly here. The closest they get was he has a grappling hook.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And that's another thing. Flying is so easy. They were making George Reeves fly. Flying is
Yeah.
not a big deal, even then.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Why not make him fly?
Y-
What's
you
the
know,
difficulty?
it's frustrating that 3 years later we'd get the X-Men movies, and Colossus was for a CGI character, essentially, the way that they got the effect for him. And Colossus is very similar looking to Steel in different variations of the character.
Sure.
I don't know why it would be unreasonable to do it that way either. Does he even need physical armor to execute this character?
Well,
I-
that's part of my thinking. It just boggles my mind that they spent $60,000 on this movie, and they had
Let
to
me clarify. It wasn't 60. It was 16.
16. Okay.
16. But still, it's an exorbitantly high amount of money. They only made 1.7 million at the box office, so it was a exponential loss.
Why they could not have done a an amazing looking costume.
Yeah.
Like Blade was right after that, and his costume was pretty solid.
Yeah. Or
Yeah.
Blade
like I
looked
said,
great.
like RoboCop was like 10 years before this.
Yep.
Like you
And
couldn't make a
RoboCop
good
looked
suit.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, RoboCop looked good.
Yeah.
So even if they used the same technology as RoboCop to make that armor, it could have been better designed armor.
Mhm.
And again, we are talking about going back to the source material and finding out and figuring out why it works,
Right.
right? And trying to translate why it works to the screen. So part of it is production design. If you have a recognizable character who already has an audience in one medium, try to translate that look so it looks like as much like the comic book as you can.
Yeah.
This applies to everybody. You know, if Galactus in the comics is a great big pink man,
Don't make him an energy cloud.
don't make him an energy cloud. You can't punch an energy cloud. What are you thinking? What are you thinking? Look, say what
These
you
guys
want
have
of
already
the
talked
Arrowverse.
about Parallax, John.
One of the things I love, right? One of the things I like about the Arrowverse and a lot of the DC TV stuff lately, one of the things I like about it is that they run right at it. You know, there's a lot in all the history of DC Comics. There's a lot of different things. DC no longer pretends that everything has to be like Batman, which
Right.
they did for 20 years.
Sure.
Now they look at whatever is the intrinsic charm of each thing, whether it's goofy or serious or preposterous or whatever, you know, they just accept it and run right at it. And that's the only way to do any comics, as far as I'm concerned, is to don't shy away from the dumb stuff.
Yeah.
Don't feel like you have to make things all serious and street and real.
Yeah, and that's like you could compare that thought to something like what Zack Snyder's been doing with these movies, and it's like making them grounded and realistic. And it's like just recently there was a trilogy of episodes released by Maggie Mayfish, basically just revealing that he's kind of a scumbag. And there was another YouTuber that basically went into his politics and basically said, "Oh, he just wants to make Rorschach over and over and over again." It's making things realistic. It doesn't help the material, especially when it's something like this. Like
Right.
lean into the absurdity of it, because
Yeah.
that's where the fun stuff is. And that's why I like Legends of Tomorrow so much. That's why it's one of my favorite of the Arrowverse, because it leans into the goofiness. This is kind of ridiculous. So when you take it 100% realistically, it doesn't quite work. Like, I'll give you a realistic Batman story. Batman slips, falls off a rooftop, breaks his neck.
That happened.
The
in
first issue
comics,
of James
right?
Robinson's Starman.
Yeah, like making these things completely realistic, you only get so much mileage out of it, and that's why Chris Nolan's Batman movies haven't aged very well.
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, Batman is one of the most flexible characters in all of comics.
True.
That you can do a darkly expressionistic, surreal Tim Burton-y type treatment. You can do a hard-edged sort of noir, realistic Chris Nolan type treatment, or you can do a camp, Lego Batman or Adam West Batman, and it works. He works in all those forms.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Because it's all there. Because it's all there. But you have to pick and choose. Because some of Batman's villains, some of his opponents, his rogues gallery, are going to work better in an absurdist treatment of Batman.
Are you talking about Condiment Man right now? Because I will not take any bad news about Condiment Man. I love that. I love that,
Don't
man.
you have a pitch for a movie version of Condiment Man?
I do have a Condiment Man movie pitch.
No. I relish Condiment Man.
Ah!
Oh, I love it.
He's my jam.
Wow.
Oh.
Okay, there's a 3-pun limit. You've got one left. So
Okay, I need to catch up on this conversation because I'm feeling a little behind.
Oh god.
Russ, how about you? Downsides for Steel, the movie. You said your rewatch wasn't as bad, and you had a not great time in the theater.
Yeah.
Expand.
I think one of the big downsides, I think that because the guy who made this movie was a 55-year-old white guy who didn't much care for the material. With Judd Nelson as the big bad, I think he felt obliged to include like a largely random, like big physical black character for as part of the bad guys. But Kevin Grievous, as bad as I Frankenstein is not actually, like, first of all, he doesn't actually present any kind of physical threat to Steel. You can't like set up this idea that like, oh, he's got muscle, and then never ever pay it off. And it's such a weird, and as I'm watching it, I'm like, there's probably a character in there that could have strengthened what was going on with the bad guys. And one of the things is because Judd Nelson's character, Nelson is fine. He's Judd Nelson. The character's motivation is clear. It makes sense, and it comes largely from the comics. But at the same time, it's not super interesting in this film because he doesn't have the personal connection with John that, say, the White Rabbit has in the comics.
Exactly. North sex appeal.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And so, to me, that a big part of what doesn't work in this is the lack of any ambition in terms of the screenwriter and the director developing the villains to be anything more than guys for Shaq to come in and knock down.
Yeah.
It's very lazy stuff.
Yeah. Why does Nathaniel Burke want to be somebody making weapons? Why does he want to do that?
I mean, I think it's just because
because
again,
bad guy.
Yeah, because bad guy. I mean, and the funny thing is, like, when I get to the rescue part, like, I delve a little bit into like, okay, explain this, and I think you could read a motivation into this character in terms of like, this is the only thing he knows how to do, and he got fired from the army. So, well, I'm gonna go do it somewhere where I can make money. But that's not in the text. You'd have to read it. Read it
the most interesting thing he did was fuck up the test at the beginning, and we don't know why he did that.
Yeah, exactly. I think that you're supposed to assume he didn't know he was going to fuck it up. I think that, again, to go back to the Green Lantern I think he thought he was going to do the same thing Hal Jordan thought he was going to do. It's like, let's just push the limits and make a point. And then when it goes horribly wrong, it's like, oh.
Right. Which would be interesting as text and not things that we have to assume.
Right.
Yeah, you shouldn't have to be trying to win a no prize to make sense of a movie.
Right.
And I mean, one of the reasons Weezy and I created the White Rabbit was to avoid exactly this, to avoid giant 8-foot tall or Steel beating up on a bunch of boring business guys in suits, which is essentially what Judd's character is. He's just, so we went classic, Spirit, Milton Caniff. We invented a dragon lady to someone who could have all the same motivations, but added two things, which was sex appeal and a personal connection, which raises the stakes, on two levels.
Yeah, it makes it more interesting when it's him versus somebody that he has a prior history with, because she does have history with him in the story of the comic. Yeah. But here it's just, they kind of work together a little bit, but there was clearly some deeper connection, a sexual connection in the book. Yes. There's none of that here, obviously.
It's not personal.
It's not a personal thing. Yeah.
It actually feels more personal for John Henry because Judd Nelson's character is like ruined his friend's career and essentially fucked up his whole military. messed up his whole military
No,
career.
you can cuss on the show.
No,
There-
10 minutes. 10 minutes for
That's
first
right,
10
that's
minutes we don't swear, but after that, yeah, it's all free.
But yeah, it's almost like it's much more personal for Jon. Like you could see Jon having a revenge thriller against this guy because he like screwed up his and his friend's career, basically out of just selfishness or the need to show off.
Sure, but why not give it the other layers as well?
Right. Yeah. Wait, are you asking for deep characters? This feels like a big ask for a movie.
Well, what I'm asking for is, particularly if a deeper character makes the plot mechanics, the actual exposition of the plot, more sensible.
Yeah,
and easier to follow.
absolutely. Yeah, emotions aren't always logical, but they will lay groundwork for decision making. And sometimes, if if you can't establish a logical reason, establish an emotional reason that I
Right.
can keep track of. Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah. And you can fortify a lot of logical exposition by giving it an emotional motivation.
Exactly. Jesse, how about you? Major downsides on your had you seen this movie before?
I'd seen it before. Yeah, I'd seen it before. Hadn't seen it in a while. So here's my big negative. He's got a big ass hammer.
Yes.
He doesn't hit a goddamn thing with that hammer in this whole fucking movie.
He uses the handle as a gun, sort of thing.
Yeah, it's a gun. Like, are you kidding? It's a hammer.
Is it?
It's a
Well,
hammer.
it's funny. I think that I don't think John and Wheezy did that, but I think that became a thing with later writers on Steel.
Mhm. Yeah, he pops up every now and again. I don't think there's ever been like a long collected story of Steel. As far as I went to the comic shop I go to, and there isn't a single collected edition of just this character.
No, they've just sort of let him go, I think.
Yeah, I think you can get it on DC Universe because the series that Louise wrote and later handed off to, I think, Christopher Priest.
Yeah.
That ran for about 36 issues, I think, and so you can read those on DC Universe, and some of it's pretty strong. Certainly not all of it, but it's all of it's probably better than this movie.
I have no doubt.
Yeah. His hammer's kind of like the inverse of Chekhov's gun. Like you're waiting for it to be used and hammer something at some point, and it never does.
Yeah.
And instead, it just shoots.
Yes.
Yeah, it shoots lasers. And that's another thing is that they have all this technology, and I'm just like, how'd they build all this stuff? Like, where'd it come from? It's just,
Yeah.
it just appears.
There was an IBM 6500 computer dropped off in that junkyard.
Yeah.
They explained this, Jesse. Weren't you paying attention?
Well, I don't know.
I
told me
wanted
to
more
just sell off the truck.
trains. You know what? I wanted more trains.
That train sequence was way too long.
It's funny because he saves that guy on the railroad tracks at the beginning, and
Yeah.
you're kind of like, oh, there's actually railroad tracks in this movie, and then that's the only time it's ever there.
Yeah, I wanted more. I was hoping for more of a John Henry connection. I was disappointed and sad.
Well, and also I think a background that had a lot more ironwork and steel in it would have added a lot of visual appeal.
Absolutely. That opening credit sequence had me fooled for a second. I was like, "Oh, is this going to be like a hardcore, sweaty steelworks kind of?" Nope, it was not.
Yeah,
No.
that's what I was thinking. It was a weird tonal shift.
Do you remember in the latter years of the Incredible Hulk TV show,
Oh yeah.
when like Thor showed up?
Yes.
Oh yeah, Surfer
Yes.
Dude Thor.
You remember that? I really felt like this was sort of in that same vein, on a par. It's Kenneth Johnson looking at an epic, large scale superhero concept and saying, how small and dumb and self-contained and Canadian after school special can we make this?
That's so true, though.
Special. That is
Why
a
does this
unique
feel like a
song.
Canadian's take on like LA? That was one of the most perplexing things to me.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah. It's supposed to be set in LA. The streets are always empty.
It's so
Yeah.
empty and clean and polite.
And the weirdest thing is, in the comics, it's not L.A. Like John
It's
Henry lives
Metropolis. Yeah, it's
well,
Metropolis.
Metropolis, but then he moves to Washington D.C. when he goes to see his family.
That's
with
right,
palm
yeah.
trees. With palm trees, obviously recognizable neighborhoods in LA.
Right.
Oh, jeez.
And here's the weird thing too. I live in LA now. I lived in Maine back when this came out, but I'm an LA guy now, and I have come across a lot of the locations that appear in this movie.
Oh no.
Really,
Oh
if you
god.
if you just put the camera here, you got this great cool overpass. If you could just turn over, take a slightly different angle here, well, now you've got an interesting off-center composition rather than, something that looks like 1970s television.
John, if you're on Instagram, you need to make that a photo series. Just your adventures in
Yeah,
LA
right.
and reframing Steel.
Visit the locations of Steel.
Yeah. Meanwhile, there's some cinematographer that would be like cursing me.
Oh, sure. But we all have
Yeah.
enemies.
Yeah.
Let's jump into the pitch. I'm very excited. When Russ sent me this pitch, it's perfect. By the way, I think you really hit the nail on the head as far as I didn't ask you this, and I meant to. Your pitch, is it kind of if they did the movie today, or is it very 97 focused?
I kind of went with if they did it today for a
Yeah.
handful of reasons. One of which is I think that you can just to say that you did it, you can incorporate the Cavill Superman in a way that follows through on the things that Snyder tends to say but not do in terms of him being a figure of hope.
Sure.
Um, and so I think that that struck me as something that oh, that's an easy gimme, because we've been told 700 times that he inspires everybody, but we never actually see him inspiring people in those films.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
so this could essentially just take that text and use it as a backdrop.
Yeah. Do you have to have it connected directly to DC mythology? Like, should this have something like Superman show up for something like that for a cameo?
In a perfect world, I would like that because I think that I like the idea of him being inspired by Superman. The other thing that you could argue, especially because one of the things that I would like to say is that I think that doing it now instead of 97, there's a much better chance of it being directed by a black director and having a much more inclusive cast. And so you could make an argument that, well, as long as you do a good enough job of laying the groundwork, you don't need Superman because then you can have this guy who isn't reliant on a white guy to lift him up.
Sure.
And so in my idea, I have Superman in it mostly because largely my pitch is that a lot of this was already right there in the comics.
Yeah.
But it's not absolutely essential. I don't think. I think you could do a slight tweak and not necessarily need it.
Before you jump into your pitch,
Sure.
John, would you like to see Steel redone as a movie now?
Well, yes, I would. I mean, frankly, I'd like to see him make more of an appearance in the comic books as well. I think that, I still feel that DC needs an Iron Man.
Yeah.
And I still think that the idea of a homemade Iron Man, because, DC already has a billionaire superhero, so we don't need to chase Tony Stark. We have Bruce Wayne. But the idea of a guy who sort of retires from the establishment, leaves the establishment, and just because he's so smart, on a shoestring, he's able to become a sort of a DIY Iron Man.
Yeah. I
think it's good to have a guy who does it not with inherited wealth, but with his brains. And I think an armored superhero is missing from the pantheon. So I think Steel should be in the JLA. I think he should be part of the core lineup there, as a diversity signal.
Sure.
He's maybe, and I don't want to slag on poor Cyborg, because God knows he. But there are things that are problematic from a sort of a political standpoint with Cyborg. You know, if you have if your token black character is his body is mutilated, there are things uncomfortable about that from a modern perspective.
Sure.
That probably weren't that noticeable back in 1980.
Right.
But still doesn't really have those issues.
Sure.
I mean, I think the fact that Steel is black, but black is not in his name. He's not Black Steel. He's you know, he just is who he is. And
he's really not a stereotype either. A lot of black characters fall into that stereotype paradox where they
So I think he's actually a good character for DC to have without looking like they're virtue signaling, you know. And besides that, he's really likable, and I think I think that there's mileage to be got from a guy whose emotional attachment to Superman was pivoting in the way that Superman is for a lot of his fans. So that I think the dynamic of that in the JLA would be interesting and have be a springboard for material. And I think just the adventures of Steel of a guy without Batman's resources, a guy without superpowers, doing the impossible is interesting to me.
Yeah. Do you have any actors in mind if you were gonna, let's say hypothetically we make this movie next year, who would you cast as Steel?
Wow, I don't know. I mean, I'd have to look to the NBA because he really has to be tall.
Yeah.
I have like 2 or 3 names that I jotted down at the top of my pitch here, and mine is kind of a dipping into the DC archives. I would strongly consider Cress Williams, because he's a terrific actor. He very much gives off that same vibe of being so kind and so thoughtful. He voiced Steel in the Death and Return of Superman movies.
Oh, that's right. I forgot about that.
Yep. And I'll tell you something else too. Steele's voice is very important, right? And assuming that in a movie nowadays, most of his action would be like Iron Man, he would be a CGI character. You know, what you're really looking for is a voice actor who does excellent voice work. So yeah, Chris might be actually a really good choice.
Yeah,
I like
he's
that.
already got his toes in DC's universe. He's already Black Lightning, so
Yeah.
not a bad choice. Yeah,
And he's
And
very
as somebody
tall.
who covers the Arrowverse for work, we didn't specifically say it, but I'm a reporter. I write for comicbook.com, and I cover the Arrowverse extensively. And I can tell you, having interviewed him a bunch of times, Cress is very tall.
Who he is.
Yeah. You can. There's a. I'll have to share it with you guys. There's a photo of me and him on a red carpet that somebody took, and he just towers over me.
Well, that's very encouraging. I like that.
Yeah, we've laid the groundwork. Russ, I'll let you take it away with your pitch, and then we'll make some comments on it and wrap things up.
All right. I've got like a narrative that I've laid out here, but the first thing I want to do is just talk a little bit about the villain at the top, because
Perfect.
the way that I've really focused most of my pitch on John Henry, and so the villain's in there, but it doesn't take as much weight in the pitch necessarily as I would have liked it to if I gave it one more pass. The big thing, I would rework Nelson's villain, Nathaniel Burke, to be a lot more suave and less brutal.
Okay.
Part of it is the idea of him being essentially an evil Iron Man. You know, if John Henry, very much like the Tony Stark of the movies, has abandoned defense contracting because he's tired of the blood on his hands, Nelson's character is the guy who says, "Well, there's no blood on my hands because everything's done with drones." And so I say evil Iron Man, but like in my pitch, he would never suit up or anything.
Okay.
If he used
Robots.
technology, yeah, exactly. He would use drones as his Iron Man, basically, which of course we've seen a little bit with Iron Man in the Marvel movies. I would also make him the number 2 to the White Rabbit.
Ooh, okay.
This would be a really late in the movie reveal, but I would want the White Rabbit to be essentially the woman who sets him up and says, "Okay, you got tossed out of the military." I would leave his backstory largely intact.
Okay.
Partly because I really like the Annabeth Gish character and the representation she represented, as we talked about at the beginning, but also because I do think that that incident as an inciting incident works pretty well. It's just that they didn't do anything to pay it off.
Yeah.
So for me, I would use that inciting incident, and when he gets bounced out of the military, there's this woman who's there to say, like, "Hey, I'm going to set you up as essentially this contractor for me, and you're going to do X and Y and Z, and it's going to set me up for my larger business for things that I want to do."
Interesting.
And there would be almost kind of an Iran-Contra thing going on where she's arming the gangs and he's arming the police, and turning the city into a war zone.
Right.
Hey, wait a minute. This is what the military and the CIA did back in the 80s.
Yes.
Yes, yeah. And this is we're talking about the fantastical and the fun and the dopey. I'm relatively political in this pitch, so I apologize if that ends up being but
they're not mutually exclusive, Russ.
True.
In the vein of Rocky IV, I envision this as John Henry with his very much DIY armor and his junkyard technology having to overcome the sophisticated tech of this billionaire.
Yeah.
But will there be a montage of Hearts on Fire playing?
I mean, probably, because why not?
Okay.
Yes, I'm here for it.
Well, the core appeal of that of that pitch is essentially the core appeal of mine, which is using the hammer to bash up robots.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That is the core appeal of John Henry, the historical John Henry, and John Henry Iron Steel, is man against machine.
Right.
John has actually done the box art for a Rock'em Sock'em Robots that I have somewhere in this office.
Really?
Yeah, it's a Superman and Metallo Rock'em Sock'em Robots from the 90s.
Oh, nice.
Oh yeah. some of my DC licensing work.
Yeah.
But I mean, the core appeal of the myth is a man standing up for the dignity of human beings against the machine.
Mm-hmm.
So the main shtick, which is also the central visual appeal in terms of action and violence, is that hammer plowing through formidable, expensive technology.
Right.
So an army of ambulatory drones, i.e., robots,
mm-hmm.
that seem like there is no way a guy in homemade armor can possibly stand up to them, but he obliterates them because inside of his armor there's a beating human heart, and inside the robots there's nothing.
Right.
Mm-hmm. All right, so I'm going to launch into the actual meat of the pitch. I needed to set up the villain stuff because, like I said, when I read it over just before this, I felt like the villain stuff was actually pretty anemic because I got so granular about John.
Sorry.
Go for it.
So in my take on this, after showing an early aptitude for engineering, John Henry Irons becomes a sought-after candidate for universities. He ends up going to the military, but because he basically rationalizes that even though he's designing weapons, the things he's doing are justifiable or even right because he's creating something that would protect Americans and protect his community from the brutality of those who would attack. John, in my envisioning, has grown up in essentially a Black evangelical community, and that was key to helping teach him never to take a life. It's something he takes very seriously.
Sure.
At home, his sister met a guy from the neighborhood, and they had a daughter. This is Natasha Irons, who becomes a major character in the comics. Living at home with Jon's parents, young Natasha grew up in Jon's shadow at school, where she was an athlete, setting a lot of the same records for girls that Jon had set for boys. With no clear path out of an increasingly crime-ridden neighborhood, she was going to follow Jon into the military over her mother's objections until tragedy struck. Her father was pulled over for a broken taillight and shot to death by police.
Yep, I like it.
A wrongful death settlement from the city sets up Nat for life, but Jon returns home to help keep the household afloat, leaving the military work behind. This, you find out later, comes right around the same time as the Nathaniel Burke incident, and that was kind of this was the two-fisted thing of like, I can't be here. Like I have responsibilities elsewhere, and this place is not where I need to be. Long after the settlement, Jon saw that the equipment he helped design was now being used by the same cops who killed his brother to quell protests in the neighborhood, and it makes him furious. One day, he was helping an on-site crew evaluate structural integrity for a new skyscraper. This is the scene from the comics. In my version, he doesn't need to be Henry Johnson. He doesn't need to hide who he is, but he is trying to use his engineering in a constructive way instead of a destructive way. Okay. And so he's helping to evaluate structural integrity for a skyscraper. A workman falls, and without thinking, Jon grabs a table, swings out, and swings the man back. The cable grows slack. He starts to fall to his death, but Superman comes, catching him, saving him, and putting him back where he'd fallen from. This is, if you read the Roger Stern novelization of The Death and Return of Superman, basically verbatim how Roger did it. And I really liked the addition that Jon was saving someone when he fell. So Superman, very much like in the comics, he tells John Henry that he'd seen what he did to save the other man, and it's people like Jon who risk their lives without powers to protect them that constantly amaze him. And Jon, kind of stunned and in disbelief, laments that Superman is essentially a god, so there's nothing he can ever do to pay him back or even the score. And Superman waves this off, saying, "That's nonsense. You want to pay me back, make a difference." And he motions back to the guy whose life he just saved. And he says, "It looks like you're off to a decent start." In the coming months, as the world constantly debated the relative merits of having a godlike being who appointed himself the world's protector, and again, like, this is because I'm setting it within the world of the existing DC movies, just for the sake of saying, like, hey, we could do this and still have a movie that's all about hope and positivity.
Sure.
Yeah.
But in the coming months, as the world debates this, Jon finds himself constantly losing patience and occasionally losing friends over his affection for Superman. Inexplicably, Superman's efforts to save people had become a political question, and Jon couldn't understand it, and he hated it. This is basically the mask debate.
I love that. I love that.
That's great.
Yeah.
So now Nat is a college freshman, and the day before she's ready to head home for Thanksgiving break, Jon heads out to a site in Hobbs Bay where he's set to oversee the demolition of some rotted out buildings. And while he's there, he hears this unimaginably loud boom. And fearing that somebody's trying to demolish the building with him inside, he runs out in a panic, only to see Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman fighting Doomsday.
Are you putting this side by side with Batman versus Superman's Doomsday fight?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Ish, because very much like in the comics, Jon picks up a hammer from the site and decides he's whatever I can do, I'm gonna go help.
Yeah.
But before he can get anywhere close to Superman, an errant blast of heat vision from Doomsday shears off part of the roof, collapsing the building on top of Jon and leaving him unconscious. By the time he wakes up, Superman has died.
Right.
Following the death of Superman, there's panic in the streets, and in the black parts of town, that means an overly aggressive police thundering through the city with a grudge. The cops are, of course, outfitted with state-of-the-art SWAT and military gear, including a number of experimental weapons that Jon had worked on during his time with Ameritech. Here we could get a shortened version of the Burke story. Again, I think that I like that as an inciting incident, but it's not super necessary, other than like this is where he came from.
Sure.
Probably the idea of killing a senator doesn't need to stay because in universe, Batman v Superman already killed just a bunch of senators.
Yeah, like yeah. I already fixed that movie. Move on.
Yeah. In my initial pitch, I said, "Hey, look, I'm going to brush up gently against the Snyder movies. We're not going to talk about that very much. It's just I like the idea of
It's
trying."
it's like at Christmas, and there's the uncle that you don't like sitting in the corner with a spear through his head. Just ignore it.
We get the shortened version of Burke being court-martialed for being over-aggressive and getting a bunch of people killed. But Burke knows enough sensitive information and is high enough ranked to stay out of a jail cell. Once out, he inexplicably comes into all this money and starts his essentially own knockoff Blackwater. But mercenaries are a competitive industry with a high failure rate. So instead of going overseas, he provides trainers and weapons to SWAT teams. Under the armor, I envision Jon wearing something kind of closely resembling. Pardon?
It's close to my core premise. But go ahead.
Yeah. I try to hew pretty close to yours, but still make it like something that could be a little bit more standalone as a movie. Under the armor, I envision Jon having something that's kind of closely resembling the black Kryptonian suit from the comics, which keeps him clothed and insulated, but also is just kind of a nice wink and a nod to the story that this character came from. Jon essentially finds himself in this position where he abhors violence, but he knows that it's required to keep the peace, especially if he can do it in a non-lethal way instead of allowing people to be just mown down.
Right.
So Jon puts together his armor. He starts going out there as Steel, and people start talking about him as essentially the heir apparent to Superman. In my version, there is no reign of the Superman, partly because it never happened in the movies, and it's not like, but also because like we don't need it for this movie, and it would be way, way too much. Like that needs to be its own film.
Well, even like the story in the comic, the actual Steel narrative compared to the Superboy stuff, the Eradicator and Cyborg Superman, they kind of all run separate to each other. Only at one point does one of them cross over, which was when Superboy interacts with Steel in the third issue. Yeah, they kind of run parallel, but very rarely ever interact.
Yeah. And that was, there's a lot of reasons for that, but obviously there were 4 different books, and each book had its own hero, and people in the neighborhood start to talk about Jon as kind of the heir apparent to Superman. With some, there's probably some fringe religious figure or another implying that he might actually be Superman's soul in human form, because that was a conspiracy theory that fans had at the time.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
He eventually gives a brief interview saying he's no such thing. He's just here to help, which is a nod to Superman the movie. Why does his face mask look like it was designed to emulate a black man? Because he wants people to not be afraid of black men, and he wants people to not to shoot first and ask questions later. The police hear this and are not fans. The final battle comes down to Jon with his homemade armor, rivet guns, and sledgehammer up against a sophisticated series of RC drones employed by Burke, dead set on killing him. The police obviously are on Burke's side in the same way that they tend to be on the side of the far right in all protests. They're not shooting at Jon, but they're not stopping Burke from doing it.
Right.
He finally works himself through all the drones, and half dead from exhaustion and with his armor almost completely shredded, finds himself face to face with the White Rabbit. This is where we find out that these two had been a couple during their days working for Amertech, and that she was essentially the only person in the outfit comparably intelligent to Jon. And so this is why you find out, oh, she's wealthy, and she's the one who sets up Burke with all this money, in order to basically have a layer of plausible deniability if it ever comes back to her as a problem.
I like that dichotomy between their characters as well.
Yeah, and I always liked, there's a cover that Jon did that shows the White Rabbit essentially having, like, standing over Jon with a smoking gun and her foot on his chest. And I like the idea that you've got this woman who has no powers, but she is capable enough and carries enough baggage with her that she can present both a mental and a physical challenge to Jon on her own. So she's the one who had aggressively lobbied the company to market them to law enforcement and the DHS, and she's the one who recruited Burke away from his mercenary attempt and ultimately kind of funneled funds into him to make him a viable business plan. In the closing moments of this movie, she tells Jon. Jon tells her it's over. He has his hammer stuck in the skull of the final drone because he's been slamming through them. But he's too exhausted and weak to remove it. So he tugs at it once or twice, but it doesn't matter. She has one of the Toastmasters, which is those giant guns, trained on him.
Mm.
And she says, John Henry's a cute story, but you always forget he didn't actually win. He didn't live to tell the tale. And then from off camera, you'll have Natasha saying, is that so? And she runs in with her own bootleg version of John's armor and smashes the White Rabbit in the gut with a hammer. And then fires a taser, because she doesn't use the rivets. She's not the John Henry metaphor. Fires a taser out of her gauntlet to subdue her.
Mm.
So later, as the news plays out in the background, debating whether Steel is a hero or menace, and whether the criminals can even be prosecuted since they were brought in by vigilantes, John recovers from his injuries and talks with Nat about the future. He thinks White Rabbit was right. John Henry died at the end of the story, and the good he does to the world is to lead by example and be a light to others, like Superman. So he says he's going to hang up the armor, but he'll still repair it in case he ever needs to use it again. And then in a nod to the next element of the Snyderverse, as he's saying this, the phone rings in his office, and when he answers it, it's Bruce Wayne asking him to come help work on the Flying Fox.
Ooh.
So basically, I say that retroactively, John was the genius behind the big armored personnel carrier in Justice League, and that's the post-credits scene.
I like that.
I like that. Yeah. Yeah. It ties it in without being overt, and it gets away from all the Snyder stuff.
And that's really, I wanted Superman, and I don't necessarily want to say, okay, I'm starting a whole new franchise and I'm going to retcon everything and blah, 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 blah. But I see it as more of a Shazam kind of thing, where it's like, yeah, this happens in the same world, but it's got its own set of rules and its own tone and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
And like Shazam, you don't actually have to see Henry Cavill's face.
Love it.
Yeah,
Especially if there's weird Photoshop involved because of a beard.
or mustache.
It was a mustache.
I got to give Henry a lot of credit, though. Like the Instagram post that he did when he shaved the mustache and his like series of end of an era jokes were just chef's kiss.
Oh yeah, very self-aware. I love that pitch. I really.
Yeah.
This is a little off topic, but I am a Cavill fan, just because I'm not a huge fan of the Man of Steel movie and basically that whole generation of DC movies. Does not mean I don't think that he's capable of being a really splendid Superman.
Did you see Justice League?
I did not see Justice League. I by that point I was so blown out of this round of this iteration
Yeah.
of stuff that I just was like, no.
So I can't recommend the film. However, his portrayal of Superman in the last 20 minutes is the most Superman he has ever been allowed to be in any of these movies.
Yeah, because by that point, Snyder was already out the door and Joss Whedon was directing. So Joss Whedon basically just said, yeah, just be Superman. Just do it. Yeah. So yeah, when you have that leash taken off the Snyder crap, he actually is he's a pretty good actor to play Superman. It's just
he is. He's actually a very good actor. If you just get him out of the stupid armor and put him in the prototypical tights, just let him be Superman.
Yeah.
Just let him be Superman.
Yeah, I hate that suit that he wears. It's so noisy and so ugly.
It's just stupid. He's just stupid. He looks like a blue basketball.
Yeah.
He does.
The thing that kills me is I understand the scale and the like armor look for most heroes. But in the same way that Diana can wear whatever the hell she wants because she's indestructible, like there's no reason Superman needs protective padding.
Oh, I agree. And on top of that,
yes, naked man.
of all the superheroes, Superman is the prototype for all superheroes. So he's the one guy that should always have the prototypical costume.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the basis point. When you try to make everybody seem so radically different, it begs the question, where'd you come up with that idea?
Right.
Like, why does the Flash's suit look like weird armor with wires all over it?
Right.
God, I hate that Flash suit in Justice League. It's awful.
Yeah, it's so stupid.
Let me pivot because there's one part of your email that I was very curious for, but I think I know the answer to, so I've got my fingers crossed.
Sure.
To quote you, there's one scene I would leave completely untouched from the original movie, but it's comic relief, not plot. So I'll spare you for now. This is where you stop sparing me. What scene would you not cut?
That would be the escalator. In my version, Steel would fly, but I would have some contrivance to keep the escalator scene, just because like it amuses the crap out of me.
Oh yeah,
Like this idea of the very anticlimactic, like he's just saved these people. He's this giant dude in this armor, and he's so impressive. And then he like goes to fly away, and it doesn't work, and he has to like get on the escalator and just bye.
yeah.
He's out of fuel and he needs to refuel,
Yeah.
so he has to just take the escalator and walk away.
Or like he saved them from a bus, and like the jet got crumpled when he whatever it is. Like I would have some some reason to just be like, okay, I want to keep the escalator joke.
I love that.
It's actually reasonable to have to get some human interest / comedy moments, beats out of the fact that he's a DIY homemade.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Particularly if it's his first night out and he's sort of field testing the suit. There should be occasional problems.
Yeah, and obviously my pitch was very broad strokes, and I didn't get into a lot of the details of exactly what that montage would be, and that's where you can insert like elements like that of things that you like, or things like the comedy would probably be pretty necessary to take us away from all the like, hey, this is all about police violence.
Right.
Well, it's interesting that you hinged your pitch on police violence, because I've thought a lot about what I would do to reboot or relaunch Steel in the comics, should I ever have such an opportunity. And one of the things that I'd go with what Wheezy did, but one of the things that I would change is the focus on gang violence, because that's part of the whole war on drugs. It's very passé, and what we know about all of that now sort of makes it not a good motivation.
Yeah.
But the idea of there being protest suppression in the form of robot drones, privatized robot drones, so which gives the police department and the city governments plausible deniability. So you can send in these Blackwater drones contracted by the city, and they can brutally put down a protest, right? And then the city can say, "Oh, well, no, this wasn't the police force. This was an unfortunate incident with this company, and they were just robots anyway, right?" So having and it's a comic book metaphor for the over militarized police forces in our country anyway.
Right.
And it also provides you with the perfect opportunity for hammers to bash robots, which is where we all want to get to.
I mean, not to go back to it again, but when I did the fix for BVS, I basically had Lex Luthor almost be like the head of Blackwater, in that he was creating this drone program that would basically replace Superman, because the entire government can't trust whether or not he's actually a good guy or a bad guy. So they said, well, we have these drones under Lex Luthor's control, and as it turns out, Bruce Wayne and his company team up with LexCorp, and they're a joint partnership. And the reason Batman wants to do it is because Batman wants to retire.
Yeah.
So if he has this drone program enabled, Batman can retire, Superman's out of business, Lex can take over.
It's funny, I don't know if you did this on purpose, but during the era that John and Louise worked on Superman the Man of Steel, Lex did something very similar. It wasn't with drones, but it was with essentially Iron Man's. He had this thing called Team Luthor, where he was trying to privatize city security.
Yes.
And immediately after Superman's death, there was actually a one-shot that was Supergirl and Team Luthor, where Lex used the death of Superman as an opportunity to really rebrand Team Luthor and try to take his place.
Huh. I didn't even realize that actually existed.
Yeah.
Holy crap.
Yeah, that was a thing that happened. And because what happened was that there was a period in time where Lex was presumed dead, and the Lex who was appearing in the comics was supposed to be his son. He was like a cloned body. And when Lex Luthor II was on the scene, the assumption was not that he was a bad guy. He was this wealthy philanthropist. He was dating Supergirl, and so he really was like doing his damnedest to brand himself as Bruce Wayne.
Yeah.
And so the Team Luthor logic made perfect sense, because he could not only try to replace Superman, but he could hide it behind community service.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like a super rich person like a Jeff Bezos donating to a philanthropic cause, but secretly they're doing really horrible shit to their workers.
Yeah.
Kind of like that, yeah.
Guys, I donated $1 million. That's $1
What do you
million more
want?
dollars than you have.
Yeah.
Eat the rich.
Ain't that the truth?
I really love this pitch. This has been just a wonderful time altogether. Russ and Jon, both of you guys, thank you so much for joining the show and gracing us with your presence.
That was really fun. Yeah,
Absolutely. Thanks for having us.
I'm glad you
Yeah.
guys had a I'm glad you guys
And
had a
I'm
good time.
glad, since I didn't share my pitch with Jon ahead of time, I'm glad that I didn't get all the way through that and have Jon be like, "You don't understand this character at all."
no, actually, it's interesting how much of your pitch is sort of been kicking around the Steelverse as with us thinking about ways to refresh the character.
I'm kind of shocked they haven't really brought him back right now in the DC universe. He kind of pops up every now and again, but never for like an ongoing, I don't think. Even when they did New 52, I don't think he actually appeared on their slate.
With the New 52, then this is a problem that they had, is that for a long time they were trying to decide, well, did the death of Superman ever happen?
I
And
was just
without
about
that,
to
they
ask
didn't have
that.
a really good origin for Jon. And so they
Right.
had him show up in Action Comics because it was set in the past. And there he was like weapons designer Jon, working with and then eventually growing alienated from Lex Luthor. And they were setting the stage to bring him back. But I think that once they got done with that, they did like 3 appearances, and then it became, oh crap, New 52's ending.
Yeah.
So if the death of Superman doesn't happen, therefore Steel doesn't happen.
Yeah, and again, I think as I kind of said at the beginning, there's definitely a way to write Steel that doesn't necessitate Superman. But I think that from DC's point of view, they wanted, because that's one of the best-selling comics of all time. So they didn't want to explicitly delegitimize it in their main continuity line. And so I think they found themselves boxed in.
I mean, the beauty of comic books is that there's a way around literally everything. So, I mean, things are being shaken up right now a lot at DC, and there's no way to say exactly how things are going to shake out. But I do think that Steel is still a good option for a Superman universe character of diversity of color. And I think that the basic premise of him is still really viable. It's not necessary to have the death of Superman in order to have Superman be the inspiration for John Henry.
Yeah.
So I think I would not be surprised if DC came around to a place where they said, well, this is a good character. He doesn't have some of the baggage that some of our other black characters do.
Sure.
He hasn't received the same sort of criticism some of other black characters. Let's get him in here and see how it works. So who knows?
Yeah.
I mean, things are enough in flux that you can't really predict at this point.
Right.
But I have actually a lot of cautious optimism about the future of DC, to tell you the truth.
Are there any writers or artists that you'd like to see helm that kind of idea, a reboot for Steel?
You mean besides Louise Simonson?
Yes, the obvious choice.
Because Louise and I would love to do it. I like I like the idea of Ta-Nehisi Coates would be great.
Oh,
I don't
Oh
know.
yes.
I don't know if he'd actually. I don't know if that's a get that they could possibly get, but I think we would get a good take there. There's a writer that our son Kal-El discovered when he was generating audio content over at Disney for Alexa. Named, is it Roseanne? What's her name? She's, oh God, I've read her. I don't remember. She's
Roxanne
really
Gay?
good. She's really good. She's a young writer of color, and she really she understands franchise writing and genre writing, and is really good at getting into character. And I expect
did you
her
have the
to
name,
be
Russ?
more of. I expect her to be more of a name in the next couple of years.
I
I
think you
wish I
might
could
be
give her
talking
the
about
boost right
Roxanne
now, 'cause I
Gay.
don't know it, but either of those would be great.
Did you say Roxanne Gay? Is that what you said?
No,
Yeah, I think that. No. Okay.
no, I don't think it's Roxanne. She's unknown still. I think by and large, because most of her work has been, there's been a lot of Disney stuff, and Disney stuff is anonymous. So,
If I remember to catch up with you, maybe I'll try to see if you can ask Kal-El and
yeah, if
pass
Cal
along
were
to these
here,
guys.
Cal were here, he'd tell you, and I feel sorry for flubbing her name. That's all.
So, did you name your son Kal-El before Nick Cage did? Were you the cool one in that group?
Oh yeah, no, our Kal-El is 35 years old.
See, all right, John's the cooler one here. It's established.
Yeah.
And the
Made
joke
the
that I
trend.
made earlier about how they brought the Superman creative team out for Lois and Clark.
Oh yeah.
Kal-El was, I don't know, 5 or something at the time. So Lois and Clark actually had Kal-El on it.
Yes.
Oh really?
Oh, that's adorable.
Yep. That was a cool experience. The being in the among the extras in, what is it, 93, 94 on the set of Lois and Clark, and we watched a lovely actor who did their Lex Luthor. What was his name?
John Shea.
John Shea.
John Shea.
There you go.
John Shea is actually a very impressive actor, and I learned something important about television. Now, this is a sidebar, so probably you can edit it out of the podcast. But the amount, you look back at Lois and Clark, and it's okay. It's Arrowverse quality television from the 90s. So it's just what you'd expect. And John Shea was like a working actor. He'd been on soap operas. You'd seen him around. He's one of those faces that you saw, right?
Yeah.
For years. I believe now that the camera, that something is lost in the camera from every performance, because we sat we stood around for hours as extras while Lex Luthor gave a speech. And it's an interesting scene in that Lex Luthor has to give the key of the city to Superman in a big Superman Day celebration out on the streets of Metropolis.
Yeah.
But Lex Luthor hates Superman. But he's the MC of this presentation, and he has to honor Superman. And the dialogue on page is, it's okay. It's okay. In person, we watched John Shea get up and give the same spiel, the same scene, again and again, take after take. He always did it, 110%. I hate that expression, but it had to be used. And I found it really impressive live. Live, even from, 10 rows back. Live, you could really pick up on the nuance of Lex presenting his public face to the audience as the hero of the city, that he wants the city to love him, and he's charming and all this sort of stuff. and he's being the big guy, giving the key to the city to Superman, blah 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 blah, and underneath it, he's dying. Underneath it, he wants to kill. And live, that came across with sterling clarity. It was almost moving. It was like going to the theater and being really moved by theater. This was acting. This was really good acting. When we saw it later on television, it was just like a scene on TV. It was like okay. It was okay. But none of the power of his live performance somehow made it onto the screen. And it makes me think that probably television and video games and animation are full of actors who give phenomenal performances that don't translate completely to the audience through the screen. And it makes me think of something that illustrator Norman Rockwell once said, which was some art critic was criticizing him for exaggerating and caricaturing and over sentimentalizing his work, and Rockwell said something which I found very interesting and which I actually use in my own work, which is that yes, he does over exaggerate the emotions and the gestures and the expressions of his characters in his work, because the average reader who picks up a copy of the Saturday Evening Post glances at the cover for a few seconds, and it's a small reproduced version of a large oil painting. But they look at it for a few seconds in reproduction and go past. So whatever emotion they're going to get, they have to get in that casual glance. And so Rockwell intentionally over-invested his work with feeling, which worked for him because he was a sentimental guy. But he put all of that onto the page, so much so that it may have seemed too much to an art critic looking at the original painting, but it came out to just the right level. And the ratio Rockwell sent was about 10%. The actual casual reader is going to see about 10% of the emotion he puts into a painting.
Yeah.
And I think that there is something to that. I think the average television viewer is going to receive somewhere around 10% of the energy that an actor puts into a scene. So I think that maybe a little bit too much inside baseball for your listeners, but I think that informs my thinking in terms of the amount of emotion I put into visual storytelling.
Real quickly, I'd like to piggyback on that because I've got a story that kind of is proof of concept for what John's saying, and also just kind of a fun thing.
Sure.
Back when I used to cover The Walking Dead, we had a Comic-Con roundtable where Scott Wilson was sitting next to me, the guy who played Herschel Green.
Yeah.
And Wilson he's a very good actor on TV. It comes across that he's a very good actor, but
phenomenal. Yeah.
In person, he's just like, he radiates this, like, you can't look away from him. Like, he's just got this presence that just steals all the energy in the room. And we were sitting around the table after the interview was done, waiting for the next person to come. And Wilson and I were shooting the breeze, and I basically told him exactly that. I was like, you've got this presence in person that really, like, only a fraction of it comes across on screen. It's really impressive. And for the rest of the time that he was there, in between all of the different roundtables, he would shoot me these like looks and do the "I'm watching you" hand, because he was just like, okay, so I'm gonna have some fun with this.
I love that.
Yeah, there's something about charisma live that a lot more actors have than you would get from their screen appearances.
Mm-hmm.
Do you guys think, to relate it back to the movie we watched, I've never met Shaquille O'Neal. I imagine he's very charismatic in person. John, did you get a chance to meet Shaq at any point?
No.
Just curious.
I would have loved to. I wouldn't be surprised if Shaq doesn't have a certain amount of star quality. So, yeah.
Yeah. That I think the maybe judging his acting in Steel, keep that. It sounds like empathetic film watching, like knowing that this was probably electric on set, or has the potential of being electric on set, and applying it that way.
Well, I mean, Shaq is an athlete, not an actor.
Yes,
Right.
I'm not saying he's going to win an Oscar.
Right. But I don't think necessarily that star charisma is limited exclusively to actors. I think sports legends can probably have it too. I don't know.
Oh yeah.
Oh, any sports.
I met him very briefly once. Again
Really?
at Comic-Con. Yeah, at Comic-Con, he was promoting some animated thing that he was doing. I can't remember what. And he was in the room for the event before mine, and I walk in and he's still there. And at the time, he was playing ball still. He had just been traded to the Celtics, which is my dad's favorite team. And so on his way out, I just said, "Hey, Mr. O'Neill, like, just wanted to let you know, like, my dad is a gigantic fan of yours, and now that you're on his team instead of playing against him, he likes you even better." And he did he like busted out laughing and clapped me on the back. He's like, "Thanks, I won't beat him again."
Sounds about right.
Mm.
Let's bring the show to a close here. As I like to do at the end of every show, I like to give our guests an opportunity to shout out things that they're working on, ways that people can get in contact with them. Obviously, this is all based on what you are willing to give out. We'll start with Russ. Comicbook.com, the big site. Big old Russ in the house. Shout out what you would like to shout out.
Sure. Yeah. My day-to-day work is at comicbook.com. I'm actually exclusive to CBS, which is the people who own comicbook.com. But so you can follow me at Russ Burlingame, which is RussBurlingame on Twitter. The same thing, but with a period between the two names on Instagram. I host a show called the Emerald City Video Podcast, which is not affiliated to CBS, but they bought us 4 years ago, and I've been doing Emerald City for 7 years, so I got grandfathered in.
Nice.
And then, as if you go to Twitter, you'll see on my pinned tweet that I'm writing a book about the 2001 Josie and the Pussycats movie. It's an oral history where I talk to filmmakers, cast and crew, and also fans to talk about how this movie went from being a box office disaster to a cult classic.
I have to admit, I really want to give it another chance now.
It's got this kind of very bubblegum anti-capitalism that if you weren't like watching out for it the first time, you might have been like and I will, without belaboring the whole thing, the thing that I will say that like is the one thing a lot of people know, but it changes the way you view the movie. It is littered. Every inch of the movie is full of product placement, and and so much so that it has to be a joke. But a lot of people, when it came out, were like, I mean, you're making the joke, but you're taking that money. No, they didn't. They didn't get a dime for any of it.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
Yeah. It was literally just like they knew that they needed. And in fact, I have a blueprint from the movie from one of the sets hanging on my wall in the office. It's from the shopping center in Riverdale. And there's an actual thing that, because they were using a real shopping center, there's a note where they cross out the HSBC bank logo, and he's like, "No, they won't let us use it."
Wow. That, for me, that's a moment like I think about the Pillsbury executive who told the Ghostbusters no.
And so they had to use Stay Puffed.
So they had to use Stay Puffed, right?
Nice.
John, how about you? Anything you want to shout out? Anything you want to...
Oh gosh, yes, but I have to do things in a way that will not violate any NDAs.
Understood.
Okay, I'm working on some animation for a popular television show.
Ooh.
Ooh.
That's really fun, and I wish I could talk about it, but I don't have the go-ahead yet. but it's somewhere in the Warner's family.
Ooh.
Broadly.
Broad.
Broadly. I'm also about halfway through a 7-issue miniseries of science, sort of hard sci-fi, written by my son and his partner Adrienne, for Storm King, which is the comic book company that Sandy King Carpenter, John Carpenter's wife, runs. So these things are really on opposite ends of the spectrum for me.
Sure.
One end is really kind of out of my comfort zone science fiction, hard edge tech science fiction, and on the other side is a kids cartoon. So it's an interesting double deadline to be juggling right now.
It's funny you mentioned Storm King, because I actually know one of the other writers working with them right now is Dwayne Swarzynski.
Oh yeah,
yeah, he's I've met him a bunch of times, and he's currently doing stuff with Storm King. And I actually reached out earlier this year to I think it was John Carpenter's agent. I was trying to reach out to him to see if I could get him on this show to talk about Ghosts of Mars, just because we wanted to know what happened. So, but he never got back to me, unfortunately.
you know what? You might actually try this seriously. Is talk to Sean, who is Sandy Carpenter's assistant, and see if maybe you could somehow talk Sandy into coming on to the show, because I mean she's qualified to talk about Storm King, of course, but she's also qualified to discuss her husband's adventures, and might be willing to. I don't know. I can't speak for her, obviously.
Sure.
But I can say that she's a pretty awesome and impressive individual, and she runs a very forward-thinking, quality-oriented company that is a pleasure to work for.
Well, speaking of awesome and forward thinking, John and Russ, thank you guys so much, very sincerely, for jumping on the show with us today.
We're happy to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
It was a blast, and I was very glad when I told you, hey, I know this is a late in the game change, but I want to bring John on. that nobody flinched at all.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
the first time we've actually had the original creator of of property show up here just to talk shit about the adaptation of the material.
If this is what your last minute surprises are like, you are always willing to, always welcome to bring on some last minute surprises.
You know, I was cynical earlier, but in general, I am a pretty optimistic guy. I'm glad you took the risk, because I also took the risk on you. And wonderful. Just what a great Sunday afternoon.
Yeah, it was fun. I had a good time.
Yeah, I had a great time. Thanks, guys.
Me too.
Big fans of both you guys. Big fans of everybody on the show, to be honest. All you guys are so impressive and wonderful to talk to and work with. We have been discussing Steel. If you're going to watch the movie, I highly recommend you do it with friends and have a good time.
Yep, and go read the Steel comics as well.
Yes.
Do that also. Thank you.
That's going to do it for us. I've been your Pitchmaster General, Seth, and thank you for listening. And good night.
Good night.
How did I find them conversation, which is basically somebody who I can't remember recommended them to me because I listened to a vaguely similar podcast for the book that I'm writing. Like, because literally they did an episode about Josie and the Pussycats, and I was like, well, I should listen to see what this is.
Oh yeah.
And that episode was a lot of fun because
So Russ, are you writing a book about Josie and the Pussycats?
I am, but I'm specifically writing a book about, it's an oral history of the 2001 movie.
Oh, okay. All right.
And basically it's, the way I'm pitching it to people is it tracks the trajectory from it becoming a box office disaster to its cult classic status that it has now. So I talked to some comic people from Archie. I talked to cast and crew, but I'm talking to a bunch of fans for like, hey, back when it was not fashionable to say on the internet that you like this movie. What kept you kind of in the game? Which has been fun. I've actually, there's a handful of comics folks who I'm talking to. Brian Bendis, his name came up in 2 or 3 different conversations, and so finally I reached out to him to be like, hey, do you want to talk about Josie and the Pussycats? Because I had spoken to somebody, and he was like my age and a dude. And he's like, yeah, at the time when that movie came out, I was my like early mid-20s. I was a guy. I was not the target market for that. I would never have watched it except that Brian Michael Bendis said in a letter column that we had to. And so I reached out to Brian, and it's funny because he and I know each other reasonably well, but I never know when he's eventually going to get tired of talking to me. A while back.
Does that man actually sleep?
I really don't think so. The funny thing with me and Brian is that I hadn't spoken to him this was like 3 years ago, and I hadn't spoken to him at that time in about 5 years. And he wrote a comic where one of the bad guys used autistic as a slur. And the night before it was published, it was still technically under embargo, so I couldn't say what the book was or who the writer was. But I have 2 kids who are on the spectrum, and I was not impressed by that, especially because it was in a Superman book, which felt really off-brand.
Yeah.
And so I tweeted it. I tweeted because again I was under embargo, I couldn't say what the book was, but I tweeted that this is a thing that had happened, and that it was a book I'd been enjoying, and a writer who I generally liked, and I was really disappointed. And that was late at night, and I went to sleep. And in the morning, by the time I woke up, Brian had outed himself as the person in question, and mounted a kind of weak defense, which basically amounted to, well, he's a bad guy. And then I slept through the entire discourse. Like, I slept through the entire thing of him coming on, outing himself, defending it, being shouted down, and then finally realizing he was wrong.
Nothing like dropping the shit bomb and then just like backing away and letting the internet do its thing.
Well, the funny thing is, I didn't even think it was a bomb, because like I wasn't naming a book, and like it had not come out yet. So it's like I figured I'd wake up in the morning, and maybe once the comic shops open, somebody would put 2 and 2 together, and then I could talk.
I mean, that's classically the way it happens. You say something you really think is carefully worded, carefully chosen, not going to trigger a shitstorm, and then of course that's the thing that does. And you're left thinking, wait a minute, that's the thing?
Man.
Well, I was already off the books. I got off the books in 98. Right. So I sort of escaped the bloodbath by ducking out early. DC seems to have bloodbaths occasionally.
Oh yeah, it's right, because I forgot.
Like
Scott
mid
Eaton was
2000, like
then.
mid to late 2000s up through like 2013, it was just like reset after reset after reset, and it was like every week it was like,
they do.
They were starting over again. Oh, a whole new crew. Oh,
there's also the behind the scenes bloodbaths. They've had 2 this year.
Oh yeah.
Where they're down, to a skeleton crew, and rebuilding really from the ground up, everything.
Oh yeah.
So behind the scenes. So possibly, I'm cautiously optimistic. While of course I'm sad for people who lost their jobs, some of whom are friends. I think that there is a sincere effort to try to inject some fresh blood, some new blood, and some fresh perspective, which because the business itself is really changing.
Yeah.
And I think maybe that's not a bad thing.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's funny because I was talking to somebody from Hero recently, and I asked them what things are looking like with all of the layoffs, both at DC and Marvel. And they said they haven't seen a lot of change yet, but that the combination of paring back the lines so that there's far fewer books, and then the push for youth and diversity, which is objectively a good thing, but it also means a lot of old white guys who have worked in comics their whole lives and thus have no benefits are going to be pushed out of the business. And so they're anticipating that we're looking at like, oh, in a year things are going to
Well,
be crazy.
I
at
mean,
Hero.
the thing is, comics have always been pretty cruel to their veterans. Just as an industry.
Oh yeah.
So
I mean, that's why
right,
Hero
so
exists.
generations of white guys
Yeah.
have been just discarded without benefits and dumped on the heap, since the beginning of the medium. So so
Mhm.
that's nothing new. All it means is that I think it was Saul Harrison once said, comics are kids drawing pictures for slightly younger kids. And that's in a way that's valid. And all the changes mean, as far as I know, really, is that now
Right.
it'll be
Yeah.
a much more diverse generation that gets cast on the junk heap later. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. And again, like I'm objectively, it is a good thing
Absolutely,
to
it's a good thing.
inject youth and diversity into comics. The interesting thing I think is that I was talking to Hero about it, and they were like, "Yeah, we expect that like everything's normal now, but we expect about a year when the reality sets in that we're going to see a bunch more people because the folks who were working and the folks who have been essentially privileged in this industry in a lot of ways, who are going to be forced out the door, are all older guys who now are going to be like, well, what next?"
I mean, it may be, or it may not be.
Mhm.
The rate of attrition, it's always been
Yeah.
the older guys getting bumped out for younger guys, always. It's just that they've always been guys and they've always been white. But
Yeah.
but that pattern, you can't get into comics without expecting that you need some sort of exit strategy for when you are no longer uh, in fashion,
Yeah.
Fashion.
right?
It's funny. One of the great, and it's when I say the name, saying great pieces of wisdom is going to sound kind of funny. But one of the great pieces of wisdom that I've ever been told about comics is from Todd McFarlane. And he puts it very, very succinctly. He's like, if they fucking did it to Jack Kirby, what makes you think
Of
they're not going
course.
to do it
Yeah.
to you?
The only thing
Yeah.
is, with Jack and with all the first generation creators, they all expected more, right? Because many of them were
Mhm.
promised more,
Mm.
but didn't have it in writing.
Yeah.
But for my generation and beyond, we've seen enough generations of guys get completely screwed and end up destitute and blind and miserable and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's an old cliche at this point. Um,
Mhm.
and
Every now and again, one gets so dramatic that it's like the Bill Messner lobes, and everybody gets shocked and has
right,
a,
Yeah.
but
a jolt of
but
reality.
it's nothing new. It's nothing.
Yeah.
And I'd like it more. I'm delighted to have youth, but youth is nothing new. It's always a new generation of young people, right? I like I like diversity, most importantly, because diversity means a broader audience. Diversity means a broader range of creators. Diversity means news. Diversity really means, just as a comics fan, we will be reading exactly the same stories, regurgitated with slight modifications every generation.
Yes.
Mhm.
We might actually get
Mm.
some new myths. I mean, there's nothing wrong with rebooting a myth, right? The Greeks did it. Every culture has done that. Every generation of storytellers sitting around the campfire tells the same old stories of whatever Hercules and Aphrodite, and they put their own spin on it every generation. There was a time when the early tales of Hercules are serious adventure stories. The later ones, he's almost a buffoon, a comic relief character. And it's interesting because that's sort of been the pattern with original superheroes. So that is part of the cycle of myth, is you reboot stuff every generation, and every new generation gets a chance to tell the same story, but with modifications to make it relevant to the current generation.
Sure.
But
it's just not a good idea when they do something like what was it? They incorporated Watchmen into the DC universe last year.
yeah, well, see, yes, and there is such a thing as end stage mythology, where if a culture only reboots and respins and tells the cycle again and again, if all you ever hear is the same ring cycle told over and over again with slight modifications every generation, eventually you get to an end stage where you just can't, it's just not interesting enough for the culture to stay alive. So a living culture, a viable culture, generates new myths to go along with the old. They don't just
Right.
regurgitate the old myths, they generate new ones. And that is where diversity, cultural diversity, ethnic diversity, gender diversity is absolutely not just overdue, but vitally necessary.
Sure.
That's
I
why
agree.
one of my favorite series is right now is Nana the Were-Spider, which is about West African mythos.
Oh, lovely.
It's really good.
There's another, and of course now I can't remember the name of it. There's a guy called Dave Baker who is doing a comic with Alex Zirrett, Night Hunters. And Night Hunters is from Zirrett's cultural point of view, and so it's all about Argentina like 150 years from now, and it's like this weird techno dystopia, but it's all rooted in the mythology and the politics of that region, and that's really interesting too.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
Yeah.
I think honestly, just as a fan and a reader, I think we're heading into, as long as the medium can still be commercially viable, I think we may be heading into a golden age similar to the way television has entered a golden age.
Yeah.
There are a lot of ifs still. There's a lot more money in television than there is in comics. And one of the things that the greater diversity in content on television has meant is that very few shows, the threshold of a viable show is somewhat lower. There's so much content out there, right, that you don't have any cultural touchstones, very few cultural touchstones. Like, you have Mad Men and you have Game of Thrones, but neither of those shows, Breaking Bad, none of the latter-day great shows had the viewership of, say, MASH in the 70s.
Yeah.
When there are only 3 things to choose from on any given night, audience share was much, much, much bigger. And now there's an awful lot of content. The content is all better than it used to be.
Yeah.
But there's so much of it that, you can miss. You can binge watch 24/7 and still miss important stuff.
Because there's so much content from so many different sources.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But there's so much money in television that they can sustain that much content and people can still live and go to work and stuff like that. Comics are so marginal anyway.
Yeah.
That new sources of revenue are going to have to be found in order to sustain a broad diversity of content. And so there's sort of a catch-22 here, because without greater diversity, the industry and the mythology is doomed, right? But with an explosion of diverse content, you can miss the lovely story about the West African spider god or whatever. It can just blow right past you. And so there are a lot of young, really talented storytellers who still have to have other jobs because comics are comics are not only not making money, they cost more money to produce than they make.
Yeah.
So the business model needs to adapt to that, so that this supposed young and diverse generation of creators, don't also have to work at Starbucks.
Right.
Yeah.
This is enthralling stuff. I'd love to jump into the episode, though. I don't want to use up too much of anybody's Sunday afternoon.
Well, let's
do
do it.
All of that was recorded, and I'll put that at the back end of the episode.
Yeah,
All right,
none
well,
of that was lost.
Let's drop the level of discourse to the 1990s masterpiece.